This week on Dialogue, we speak with co-authors Martin and Susan Tolchin about their new book, Pinstripe Patronage, Political Favoritism from the Clubhouse to the White House. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests this week are Martin and Susan Tolchin. Susan Tolchin is a political scientist who serves as University Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University. Martin Tolchin spent 40 years with the New York Times, after which he founded The Hill and Politico. He's now a Wilson Center Senior Scholar. Together, the Tolchers have written 7 previous books. Martin, Susan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Book number 8. My wife and I can barely make dinner together. Co-authored 8
We
books.
can barely play golf together.
Let's begin there. A political scientist, a journalist.
Right.
What kind of either compatibilities or incompatibilities exist in how you approach a book?
Well, as Martin said, we can't play golf together, but it's very easy to write books together. We don't even know who wrote what anymore. And in academia, when someone says something is journalistic, it's usually an insult.
Yeah, right.
But I think, and in journalism, when they say somebody is too academic, it means boring.
Inaccessible.
So we think we've taken the best from both areas, and we hope we're not too boring.
Anyway. Not at all.
But Martin taught me how to write much better than I was.
That's some about how to be concise and direct and things
That's
like
right.
that, the journalistic approach. Well, let's start at the end and work our way back.
Okay.
The most cynical view of this town and patronage is that it's swimming in corrupt money and that the only way you get to have your say is if you pay your way.
Right.
Why don't you analyze that most cynical view? How close to that is the reality?
It's close.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It's close. Certainly, money gives you access and influence. There's no question about it. Somebody who gives huge contributions has better access than a woman on welfare. No question about it. Or even welfare organizations. But we feel that patronage is an essential tool of government. That people who know how to use patronage get things done, and actually that's how Reagan got his tax cut. That's how Clinton got NAFTA. Here in Washington, it's how Fenty got control of the school board. It's how Bloomberg in New York, Mayor Bloomberg in New York, got a ban on smoking in restaurants. When you've got heavy lifting to do, you have to do something to persuade people to help you. And Bloomberg told us that some people, when they want something, go up to you and hit you with a 2x4. But he said he goes up to somebody and gives them hugs and kisses. And he has lots of hugs and kisses to give out because in addition to all the government favors, he reaches into his foundation and into his own pocket to get things done. And he's been a very successful mayor.
So what you're describing is something as old as politics.
Exactly.
Maybe even the grease that makes the gears work together.
Biblical.
Is it universal?
It morphs into corruption. I mean, it's easily morphed into corruption.
But is it universal? Let me ask you that first.
Yes.
Is it what we think of as patronage in politics in America, is this politics written across the globe?
We think so. We think so, absolutely. And, you know, here at the Wilson Center where we do works in progress, and I gave a little work in, we both gave a work in progress here, and we described patronage as one of the occupational hazards of democracy, and hands shot up, and somebody from the Soviet Union said, that's how Stalin stayed in power, and somebody who had studied Hitler said Hitler gave all these things away to his lieutenants. That is absolutely universal.
Now, Susan, this isn't the first time that both of you have visited this subject matter. Right. This is sort of the new version of the evolution of patronage. Talk about your original interest in the subject matter. Why were you interested in the first place?
Well, when we wrote another book on patronage. Our very first book was on political patronage, and it came out in 1971. And Chicago then was the patronage capital of the country, and people got jobs and contracts and judicial patronage and refereeships, guardianships, et cetera. And we took another look at it because in the intervening years, there were 5 Supreme Court decisions that invalidated patronage, that basically said it was a violation of the First Amendment, free speech, to give out jobs on the basis of your political views or contracts. And when we looked at it again, it's bigger and better than ever. There are big budgets. Governors have big budgets. Mayors have big budgets. The federal government is huge. We've reduced government, but we've increased patronage contracts.
Talk about that evolution and why you decided to revisit the subject matter, even the qualifier, pinstripe patronage.
Right.
What are you communicating? What's different?
Well, with patronage initially was the Christmas turkey, and it was jobs, sewer inspector, etc. It was basically city jobs, state jobs, federal jobs. But now it's become big business. Now it's become billion-dollar contracts in Iraq for Halliburton. Now with outsourcing and earmarks and privatization, government has huge bucks to give people who have supported political leaders. So it's kind of morphed into that, and because it now helps people more at home in the boardroom than on the assembly line, we call it pinstripe patronage. Actually, the term, I think, originated in Chicago.
The birthplace.
Actually, you know, you'd much rather have a job. Now there are thousands of quasi-government groups. You can pay executives in these quasi-government groups a whole lot more than you can pay a civil servant. So it's much better. Much better jobs.
Right.
If you, one of the recent, not the present one, but one of the recent heads of Fannie Mae made $21 million a year.
Right.
So you can really do very well, and this is why we call it pinstripe patronage, because
The
it's so much
momentum
more
you
lucrative.
describe seems to mirror the economy as a whole, where the sort of the corporatization of everything.
Right.
So the good old days of patronage were, you know, assembly line jobs or turkeys at the holidays. Now it's $21 million salaries.
Right. Plus, it's a way that politicians have circumvented the Supreme Court decision, because they're not giving away government jobs; they're giving to private industry.
Yeah.
Mostly on a no-bid basis, because after all, if you're giving contracts to companies that are working in Iraq, you don't have time to put this out for bids.
Yeah, I want to revisit some of that in more detail, but I also wanted to ask you about when it was almost as you were talking about it nostalgically, the good old days of honorable patronage versus what it's morphed into today. You know, the conventional wisdom that one of the things you address in the book is that the notion that the big political machine, you invoke Chicago as an iconic version of that, is those days are gone. You say differently, the machine still matters.
Very much so, and actually if a voter goes into a voting booth, the voter will probably know who the candidate for governor is, who the candidate for Senate is, probably will not know who the candidates for judges are. These are people he never heard of. How do they get on the ballot? Through the machines, through the organizations. And they're very, very much alive everywhere, everywhere.
And we are the only country, only democracy in the world that has judicial elections in half our states.
Let's spend some time on that, the judges.
Yes.
This is, you identify this as an area of some potential real mischief that has really long-term implications. Talk to us about this.
Well, there are lots of goodies in the courthouse. Most judges are very hardworking and serious people and honorable people, but the whole system is wrong. Why are we the only country, one of the only democracies, industrialized democracies, that have judicial elections?
Why are we?
I think it's habit. Half our states have judicial elections, and this can really be.
It's hard to change things.
It's hard, and there was one very famous case in West Virginia, where the jury awarded millions of dollars, $50 million or something, to one individual who claimed that another coal company drove his company out of business, and then there was an election in between. The loser financed a winning judge, who didn't recuse himself. So the Supreme Court said, hey, you should recuse yourself. I mean, here he was sitting on a case that involved millions of dollars and refused to recuse himself. So I think that this kind of justice on eBay, which is what we call it, is wrong, and it's very clear.
One of the things that's hard to get a handle on, Susan said something that a lot of people will say generously, well, look, most judges are honest and hardworking, but How widespread is the problem? That's what's hard to discern from that type of analysis. Is this a widespread problem? Is there a lot of either corrupt or incompetent or underqualified, however you want to parse it?
There's no way to know. There's really no way to know whether how widespread it is, because an individual case comes from West Virginia, it comes up to the Supreme Court. We really don't know whether this is occurring in other states. But actually, something very interesting came out in our research, and that is that the richer states have much more to give out in terms of, if somebody dies without a will,
bigger budget.
Right. Exactly.
Somebody is in charge and gets loads of money and gets a share of the estate. So there are bigger budgets in industrialized states, and also lots of goodies that richer people, and lots of goodies for people who go to the clubhouse or the equivalent of the clubhouse today. Speaking
of your research, you talked to around 200 people?
Yes.
How forthcoming are they in talking about a subject like patronage?
It varied. Some were very forthcoming. I mentioned Mayor Bloomberg. Governor Mitch Daniels of Indiana was very forthcoming. Ken Duberstein, who had been Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, very forthcoming. And some were kind of skittish. But, politicians come in various sizes, and some people who know patronage and relax about patronage, like Ed Rendell, governor of Pennsylvania, to them it's just kind of fun, and there are marvelous, marvelous stories involved.
In that regard, Rendell seems like a throwback to an age where he enjoys just the fun of politics.
Right, he does, and you could tell, Rendell, as an example of patronage, Rendell campaigned for Hillary Clinton in Pennsylvania during the Democratic primary, but he had little choice since Clinton had appointed Rendell's wife to the judiciary and had promoted her to the Court of Appeals, in addition to which Clinton had saved the Philadelphia Navy Yard, had done a lot of favors for Rendell. So that is a very good example of Jake Arvey's definition of politics. Politics has many definitions: the art of the possible, the art of compromise. Jake Arvey, who was the Democratic leader of Chicago, said, to me, politics is the art of putting people under obligation to you. Mm-hmm. And Clinton and Rendell, Clinton and Jim Blanchard, very, very good examples. And Clinton got NAFTA through. We mentioned there was a lunch where we invited Tip O'Neill and Bill Brennan, who was then had just retired from the Supreme Court, to a lunch because they'd always wanted to meet each other. They were both liberal Roman Catholics. They had both come to Washington at the same time, late 1950s. And Tip was regaling us with a story about he was asked by Clinton to lobby 17 House members on behalf of NAFTA. And he recalled when he went to Jimmy Carter and a similar lobbying request, and Tip said, call the fellows in and see what they want: a bridge, a highway, a VA hospital. Carter didn't speak that language, but Clinton definitely did. Whereupon Mary Brennan said, Tip, that's a hell of a way to run a government. And Tip said, Mary, darling, that's the only way to run a government.
When you were in the course of your research, what was the thing that most surprised you? Did you find anything that you didn't expect? Well,
actually, it was very interesting. The members of Congress, that intrigued me the most. They're really between a rock and a hard place, so the cliche goes. Because on the one hand, voters in their districts expect them to bring home the bacon. Bridge to nowhere, $400 million to take 200 people from an island in Alaska over to the mainland. Right. And the president won't get any cooperation at all if he takes those out of the budget. So that, on the one hand, they're expected to bring the stuff home. On the other hand, they're criticized severely when they bring home a grant for, they have everything from a mariachi band, money to spend on a mariachi band, to a bridge to nowhere. And it's really, it's expected of them. On the other hand, they They get roundly criticized for it.
And I'm guessing one thing that really exacerbates this scenario is the rising cost of campaigns.
That's right.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
And so is there a way out for particularly members of Congress? Every
That's
2
right.
years, members of the House, every 2 years, what you hear from them is their biggest complaint is that they are constantly fundraising.
Right.
So do you see a way out?
Well, people are always proposing a federal funding of campaigns, but incumbents who got there the old-fashioned way don't seem to like that idea.
Can you reduce patronage without publicly funded campaigns?
Well, you know, you had the presidency. The presidency has public financing, and we haven't had a presidential candidate since we've had the law who accepts that because they can raise so much money outside.
If it's a voluntary system, it
Won't work.
Right.
Well, you mentioned the presidents. What about presidential patronage? You touch on that in the book as well.
Well,
Tell us a few
the president won't get a bill through without using a whole lot of favors, as Marty just talked about.
But is it the old-fashioned jobs and things like that?
Well, it's to some extent it's jobs. To some extent it was, Ben Nelson's price for his vote on the health care reform. Was Medicaid waiver for his state. Mary Landrieu's price was money for New Orleans, which, of course, all of this translates into jobs. All of this translates into money for the state. All of this translates into making them look good with the voters. But in addition to which, of course, the president appoints ambassadors. Those jobs have, often gone to major contributors, appoints the head of Fannie Mae, as Sue was talking about, $21 million a year salary, appoints all boards and commissions, appoints judges, and, of course, oversees all the federal spending, which includes all the contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan and everywhere else.
Speaking of those, I would say in reading the book, some of the most disturbing information is about this trend to outsourcing, privatization, these hybrid organizations that you identify, where even things like national security are being farmed out.
Exactly, intelligence.
Yeah, we privatized foreign policy, virtually privatized foreign policy. Iran-Contra was nothing compared to what we're doing now.
Right.
I mean, security, the State Department relies on private contractors to protect its personnel in Iraq and other places. We've farmed out analyzing intelligence. We've farmed out a lot. We privatized a lot of things, and sometimes it's very dramatic. I mean, a lot of the scandal affecting returning veterans who came into Walter Reed, the substandard care that they were getting, could directly be attributed to privatization of some of the functions of that hospital.
Is that the biggest impact, is the lack of accountability?
I think so. It's not, I mean, we bought trailers for FEMA. FEMA bought trailers to house people who were displaced by the hurricane, and they were just full of formaldehyde. They were defective. And so you're really, it's a scandal, and I think there are individual scandals, and whether they all come together eventually will create some sort of public pressure to cut it out.
It's also
it's not accountable. These are not accountable. When you hire a private contractor, that company is not accountable to anybody.
Well, a number of contractors in Iraq have had to give back billions of dollars in overcharging. And charging the government for services and personnel that were never received or were delivered poorly. And I think Halliburton has had to give back the most, threatened with lawsuits. I shouldn't say billions, I think hundreds of millions.
This is almost a big invisible story. It's like the old parable about blind men and an elephant, where people see parts of it, Halliburton, it bubbles up, but the big picture of this momentum, how far back does it go? When did this trend begin?
Well, actually, in our first book, we mentioned Brown and Root, which was a precursor of Halliburton. Now Halliburton is a subsidiary of Kellogg Brown and Root. But Brown and Root, the executives of Brown and Root were huge supporters of Lyndon Johnson, and by some coincidence got to build all the major buildings in Vietnam, all the runways and they got all the major contracts in Vietnam So it goes back, and I'm sure it goes back even before Lyndon Johnson. But Lyndon Johnson was a master of it.
Is it an irreversible trend?
Well, I think so. I think it's almost irreversible unless there is really a public outcry. But it is an irreversible. I mean, it's politics as usual. It happens on every level of politics. The president can't get a bill through without trading off a lot of these patronage favors. You can't run a judicial system without it. Members of Congress can't get reelected to the House or the Senate without bringing home lots of goodies and earmarks to the district. It's kind of like trade. Everybody's a free trader except for the company in his or her district. Protectionist.
When you look at this world of patronage, and you've identified that there's such thing as good patronage and bad patronage. Not all bad, but we're focusing on the bad. What's the worst scenario? When you look at it and you say, what worries you the most?
Well, I think before we get into what's bad about it, there are a lot of good things about it. Lyndon Johnson used patronage to get Civil Rights Act, to get Medicare, so that when you're twisting arms and you're using this stuff, no business gets done without it. So I think you have to be sort of value neutral about, well, we had to be sort of value neutral because a lot of good stuff happens. We have a story about Ruth Ann Milner, who was the governor of Delaware. And women's groups had supported her. She started as a file clerk. Women's groups supported her, and as a result, she made a lot more appointments. She was the first governor in the state to appoint as many women to the judiciary commissions and so on in the whole in the history of that time. So it can be used for good and evil.
But what worries you the most when you look at this?
What worries me the most is the whole campaign finance system and the necessity. It's getting much worse. We interviewed, for example, Marcy Kaptur, a congresswoman from Toledo, Ohio, in her office on the Hill, and she held up a batch of pink slips, messages, telephone messages. She said they're all requests for money. I didn't come to Congress for this. I came to Congress to make policy.
And on the Hill, in both the House and the Senate, if you want to get a committee chairmanship, you have to come up with contributions. Ralph Regula was in line the committee chairmanship of appropriations and got beaten out by somebody who just contributed a whole lot more money to the party. So it's very clear to every member of the House and the Senate that if you want to succeed, if you want to become a subcommittee chairman or a committee chairman, you've got to come up with the dollars. And that is, we think, kind of an ominous trend.
Whenever we talk about these types of problems of governance in Washington, we certainly focus on the federal government, but you look at the state houses and the grassroots patronage, and you use a term, web of cooperation. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, governors are just that's just one role in a state. The people that have a whole lot of power are the controllers, the money people. You never think about who you're voting for controller. You don't. Most of the time, you don't even know who it is. But those people control tens of millions of dollars in government pensions and wiring for buildings and little shelters, bus shelters. I mean, the kinds of things that go into cities and states are just enormous. So that's patronage, and the people that direct that have a great deal of power, hidden power.
And how deep did you go into these local types of patronage?
Very deep. Actually, that was the origin, really, of our interest in patronage. I had interviewed the Brooklyn Democratic leader, a guy by the name of Stanley Steingut, in his office. And in the course of the interview, he got several telephone calls. And the first call, he said, "Yeah, Max, you get the cafeteria, but Harry gets the wiring, the electrical part, and Joe gets the plumbing, et cetera, et cetera." It went down a whole list. "Yeah, Joe, you get the plumbing, et cetera." And after about the fifth call, I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Steingut, I couldn't help overhearing your part of the conversation. Were you talking about a public building or a private building?" And he gave me this wonderful smile and said, "Does it really matter?"
Well, how do you make the case to a skeptic that this isn't all bad? We can't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
It's just an essential part of government. I covered John Lindsay in New York. John Lindsay didn't believe in this at first. He got clobbered. He couldn't get snow removed. He couldn't get anything done. Then he started little city halls, which were like little wards, and he came around. And I compared Lindsay with Daley, who, for all the problems of Daley and all the scandals, at least Chicago got this. The streets were clean, the snow was removed, etc. I think it's the way of the world, and it's just a very important tool of government.
There are some counter sources or trends, I should say.
Right.
We've seen the Pentagon taking back some of the things it had
Right.
been farming out.
And the Tea Party. The Tea Party
is a counter trend to this?
Yes, the Tea Party led to the defeat of several people who were on appropriations committees, starting with Senator Bennett of Utah. And what did they have against him? The fact that he brought home the bacon. Congressman Mulholland, West Virginia, same thing. So they went after the appropriators. Now, it used to be it was great to be on the Appropriations Committee. As a matter of fact, in the House, the subcommittee chairmen are called cardinals. They are extremely powerful. But that is part of the counter influence. Also, there are people who have gone against the patronage trends, and we have a story in the book about Warren Rudman. Warren Rudman was never a spendthrift. He went to Syracuse University, and just before he got his degree, or thought he was getting his degree, they told he received a notice that he had to pay an $8 diploma fee, which he declined to pay. 6 months later, he's in Vietnam, and there's a lull in the action. He writes to the president of the university. If something happens to him, would they send his diploma to his parents? It would mean a lot to them. President writes back, certainly, as soon as we get your diploma fee. A few years later, he's in the Senate, and Al D'Amato wants to get a huge grant for a new facility at Syracuse University. Rudman blocks it for the 12 years he's in the Senate. So cost-benefit analysis, an $8 diploma fee versus multi-million-dollar facility for Syracuse University.
Payback.
Payback.
Thank you very much, and good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In addition to thanking our guests, I want to thank you for joining us and let you know that we'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us. In bookstores now.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.